I'm Marcy Winograd, a member of the Veterans for Peace Climate Militarism Project, also coordinator of CODEPINK Congress, more on that later. It's my great pleasure on this Earth Day in 2022 to welcome you to our webinar, Averting Climate Catastrophe, No New Arms Race, with an exclamation point. With the U.S. rushing weapons to Ukraine, Pentagon contractors cashing in, and Russia pounding eastern Ukraine, it's imperative we amplify our voices for peace, for negotiations during these perilous times when we face existential threats from both the climate crisis and the nuclear arms race. Our panelists today include David Vine, author of The United States of War and Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. Also, Ann Wright, a retired Army colonel. Hey, Ann, a good friend who resigned her post with the State Department to protest the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Ann has also been working tirelessly with CODEPINK to shut down the Navy's Red Hill fuel facility leaking petroleum into Pearl Harbor's tap water. We also look forward to hearing from Erik Edstrom, a platoon leader in Afghanistan who wrote the book, Un-American, A Soldier's Reckoning of Our Longest War. Great lineup. Each speaker will present for approximately 8 minutes. When they're through, we will have a chance to ask questions for about 20 minutes. Before hearing from our panelists, however, veteran Jim Ryan, one of our founding members, will share a preview of our slide presentation on the impact of militarism on the climate. This is a slideshow that we have shared with both environmental groups and peace organizations in the hope of centering militarism in climate advocacy. We know that for too long, environmentalists and peace activists have operated in separate silos. So part of our mission as the Climate Militarism Group of Veterans for Peace is to build a broader coalition to address the world's single largest institutional emitter of greenhouse gases, the Pentagon. To this end, our Climate Militarism Project has worked closely with Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who has introduced HRES 767, HRES 767. This is a resolution calling on the U.S. military to track, reduce, and report each year its greenhouse gas emissions. So please ask your House representative, your Congress member, to co-sponsor HRES 767. As a working group, we advocate for reducing the unsustainable annual military budget. President Biden is proposing a military budget next year for over $800 billion. We also push for closing military bases around the world, more on that, demilitarizing our foreign policy and redirecting funds toward thwarting the climate crisis. Now, I'd like to introduce Jim Ryan, a Vietnam-era vet, founding member of Veterans for Peace's Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, and a retired research geologist. Jim will preview our slideshow, and while you're watching, please think about who in your community would benefit from seeing these slides. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Marcy. I appreciate it. And let's see. Okay, here we go. What I'm going to be presenting today is more in line with the theme of not the standard slideshow, but of the theme of averting a climate catastrophe, no new arms race. Now, right now, and as we know, as of the end of February, both the IPCC report, new report came out giving the bad news about climate, and the conflict in Ukraine has started, and it is going to be spawning a new arms race. Now, again, the theme, and I hope we address this in some of the discussions, is can the world have an arms race and still avoid 1.5 degrees Celsius? Now, the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, one of the features that we try and advocate for is saying that we can't shrink the emissions of the military without actually shrinking the budget. And unfortunately, not only is our budget for military going up, but also NATO and other countries. Now, what is the situation? The diagram on the left is from the recent ICC report, and it shows emission levels are going up. This is from 1990 to 2019. The blue is industrial CO2, the yellow is land use, the red is methane, and the black is nitrogen oxide and fluorocarbons. Now, all these things are going up. And the other thing, and they're not peaking, and what was said in the report is that emission levels have to peak by 2025 in order for us to even hope to get to 1.5, stay below 1.5 degrees. Now, where are the major emissions coming from, especially from the United States? Well, as I think most of us know, but I'll tell you now if you don't, U.S. military is the largest institutional emitter of CO2 and consumer of oil. And one example of those large emissions is the United States Air Force. And for instance, a B-52 consumes as much fuel in 1 hour as the seven average cars do in a year. And then, of course, you multiply that. The United States Air Force has over 13,000 planes. It's the world's largest fleet, aircraft fleet. That is about almost 3 times as much as Russia, our supposed rival, and 4 times as much as China. Now, why are those emissions so high? Well, the emissions of the US military is so high because we keep throwing so much money at it. So the histogram of the diagram on the left shows the expenditure of the United States, $778 billion for the last fiscal year, or this fiscal year, 2022. Then in the diagram or the column on the left shows that China spends a third of what we spend. Russia, another rival supposedly, a tenth. Now, some would say, well, look, these expenditures are the same, or pretty close. Well, the column on the left includes Germany, France, Japan, and hopefully they won't be attacking us. Now, we're spending, and this is with Joe Biden, we're spending $778 billion compared to what was spent or allocated for climate, $28 billion. So $28 billion, about 4% of what we're spending on the military. Now, an example of the waste, how much waste this is. During the war on terror from September 11th, 2001, we spent 16 trillion on just the military alone, not counting things like border security and stuff like that. And this is from the National Priorities Project. We could have funded 3 times over 100% renewable energy with that amount of money. So instead of funding endless wars, we could have been doing so much more with that. Of course, some people would say that it's not a waste of money. And this is from the National Priority Project. A typical year, about half of DoD budget goes to contractors. That is for services and goods, material, things like that. And the organizations shown on the screen get about almost half of what that half is. So they're the major receivers of the funding. And since 9/11 of 2001, they spent over $2 billion just on lobbying alone. That's why they keep getting more money. Now, the chart on the left shows projected emissions. Well, actually from 2010 to 2050. These are emissions with projections going out to where we need to be. So the red is the current active policies, and that'll get us to 1.5 degree by 2040, and then out of 2100, we might be at 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. The gray lines, and there's 2 of them, will get us to 2 degrees Celsius. If we start now, or if we start out in 2030, these 2 lines show if we keep continuing, then there might be a rapid drop. We can get to 2. The blue line is where we should be to get to 1.5, and we're not anywhere close there. So again, emissions must peak by 2025 to avoid 1.5 degrees, which is where we want to be. Unfortunately, again, this is partly implemented by the war in Ukraine. In the budget proposal given by Biden, there is an increase of 4% for 2023. So for the next fiscal year. 2024, there's a plus 3% increase. So we're already up over $8 billion. This is what Biden's asked for. And then in 2025, it's only an increase of 2%. Now we could throw stones at Biden, but the Republicans were to take over, they want even more. So I want to end with, if we go into what has looked like it's going to happen, a protracted war in Ukraine, it's not only going to be bad for the Ukrainians, it's going to be bad for humanity, because it's going to be hard, as we have shown, with this conflict going on, to get military emissions lower and also to get cooperation. VFP has called for immediate ceasefire that accommodates security needs of Ukraine, Russia, and Europe. And then with the reductions of military spending and redirection of those funds to address the climate crisis. And if you go, we'll put into the chat a link to our statement on COP21, our statement on the Ukraine issue and the IPCC report. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Jim Ryan, founding member of the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project for Veterans for Peace. Let's begin our panel. Our first featured speaker is Dr. David Vine, professor, Department of Anthropology at the American University. Dr. Vine is a widely sought after speaker and authoritative source on militarism and empire. He is also the author of The United States of War, as well as Base Nation: How the U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. Thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you so much, Marcy. You are definitely too kind, and I might challenge some of what you said so nicely about me. But thank you to you. Thank you to Veterans for Peace. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Colleen Kelly. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone who helped put this really important event together. I can't underline more the importance of uniting the climate justice movement and the anti-war movement. And really, I just want to echo a few things that Jim said today. Let me share my screen. Some of the importance of uniting these two movements was brought home to me in some language that I saw this week. The climate justice movement must be anti-war. Or, excuse me, as the great activist Monica de Oro said, riffing on some language she said, the anti-war movement must be pro-climate justice, and the climate justice movement must be anti-war. We can't, those of us in the anti-war movement, just expect climate justice activists to join us and take up on our message. I think we in the anti-war movement need to ensure that we center climate justice and confronting the climate emergency, global warming, as a central part of our message and activism. To echo again some of what Jim said, I think we need to emphasize that we can't afford another arms race. We can't afford another Cold War. We can't afford more war. We can't afford more war for many reasons, of course. First and foremost, because people are dying because of the destruction we're seeing in Ukraine, the destruction we see in Yemen, in Somalia, and in many, many more wars around the world. We can't afford more war, again, as well, because of the carbon footprint involved and the environmental damage that war inflicts. We also can't afford more war because of the, literally, as Jim showed us, trillions of dollars that the United States alone has squandered and will continue to squander if we do not choose another path. Let's just take the $8 trillion that the United States has spent on the last 20 years of war. $8 trillion with a T. $8 trillion on 20 years of war since the United States invaded Afghanistan in October 2001. $8 trillion. 8 trillion. 1 trillion is hard enough to fathom. $8 trillion. If we really stop and think about $8 trillion, it should probably make us weep what we could have done with that $8 trillion. What we could have done to confront the climate emergency, to convert our energy infrastructure into a green energy infrastructure, among so many other needs that are facing humanity in the United States and around the world. $8 trillion on war, just the wars themselves, in addition to the 16 trillion total that the United States spent on preparations for war worldwide since 2001. This is where the money is. This is where the money is. This is where the money is that could convert our energy infrastructure. This is where the money is that we could use to confront global warming, climate change. This is the money that has been stolen from us. Remember Eisenhower's words in his 1953 Guns and Butter speech. This is what Eisenhower called a theft. This is the money that the military-industrial complex, the military-industrial congressional complex has stolen from us. This is what must change. And this is why we must unite the the global climate justice movement and the anti-war movement must unite in wildly creative new ways, I would offer, to change this status quo of war and growing carbon use. When it comes to Ukraine and Yemen and wars far beyond, we have to do everything in our power to end these wars as soon as possible, to stop the killing and the destruction, to stop the environmental damage. I think we have to emphasize again and again that there are no military solutions to these wars. In Ukraine, there is no military solution. Sending weapons alone will not bring that war to an end. More sanctions, I think, are also not likely to bring the war to an end anytime soon. We have to engage in negotiations. We have to engage in negotiations that involve compromise. We have to encourage the Biden administration, urge the Biden administration to engage in productive negotiations, likely and hopefully combined with the power of the Chinese government. Otherwise, we are likely to see war continue, a war that will just continue to take thousands upon thousands more lives and wreak untold destruction on Ukraine. Destruction that, of course, could all too easily spill over outside of Ukraine and bring upon what should be most frightening of all to all of us around the world, the possibility of nuclear war. While we urge our government to engage in productive negotiations, I think we also have to go on the offensive. We have to go on the offensive about calling, excuse my language, bullshit on plans to increase the US military budget by billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. If anything, the war in Ukraine has shown the weakness of, sorry, my alarm is going off to alert me that I just have a minute left so I can keep to time. If anything, the war in Ukraine has shown us the weakness of the Russian military. There is simply no reason to spend billions of dollars more. In fact, this is the time to cut the military budget. And in fact, what better sign of strength would there be than to say, we're good. We are spending far too much on the US military now and have no reason to spend billions of dollars more. As Jim mentioned, the United States spends as much as the next 11 countries combined, more than 10 times what Russia spends on its military, more than 3 times what China spends on its military, and all the other NATO members combined spend far more than Russia. Putin's military has shown its weakness, and there's no reason to panic into spending billions more that will, again, as Jim showed us, only line the pockets of the military-industrial congressional complex. To conclude, I think we can go back to Eisenhower's words. Remember, sorry, how he said, my computer is, every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. I think today, Eisenhower, and today we must say, every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies a theft from building a green energy infrastructure to save the planet. Thank you. Look forward to the discussion that will follow. Sorry for the technical incompetence.
Thank you so much. David Vine, author, professor, activist, pushing to close some of our 750 military bases around the world. We look forward to hearing more from you, and I want to urge participants, please post your questions. You should have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you don't, you can post your questions in the chat, though we'll be looking primarily at the Q&A button. And we'll spend about 20 minutes with questions after we hear from our other speakers also. We look forward to hearing from Colonel Ann Wright next. Ann is a retired U.S. Army colonel, former high-ranking U.S. State Department official who resigned her position in protest of the illegal U.S. invasion of Iraq. She has continued to be a powerful voice for peace and the environment. I am proud to work closely with her in CODEPINK, and we fully support, as does Veterans for Peace, her efforts to shut down the Navy's Red Hill fuel facility, leaking petroleum into Hawaii's tap water. And we're going to hear more about that campaign. So Ann, take it away.
Well, thank you, Marcy, and thanks to Vets for Peace for organizing this on Earth Day. I would say happy Earth Day, but I don't think the Earth's very happy. I'm not very happy. As David just recounted for us, the effects of, and Jim mentioned the long-term effects that we're going to see with this war on Ukraine. And it's not the only war, as we've mentioned. There are other wars that are going on in the world that aren't getting any attention at all. But certainly that huge expenditure of monies and for the the purchase of this huge amount of weaponry that's going into to Ukraine. And the slide that shows 50% of all the military budget goes to, who do we know? The great arms dealers of the world. It's horrific. I will put in a little show here of some of the things that perhaps David will remember here. Let's see. Okay, you see that one, and let's see if I can get it. Okay, we'll go there. And okay, so I live out in Hawaii, out in the middle of the Pacific, right there, and that's the headquarters of the Indo-Pacific Command, the command that has military bases all over the region. And of course, that's our, as they're calling it, our near peer. They don't quite say enemy, but indeed it is for China. And I guess the Chinese are kind of going, whew, maybe all this attention on Ukraine, maybe the U.S. is not going to go after us quite so badly as it has, but that's not true. Here's this was not taken from David's books, but, and thank you, David, for your such a comprehensive look at all of the U.S. military presence around the world. The 750 to 800 bases. If you look to the Pacific over here, where my interest for Western Pacific is, and you see the huge numbers of military bases. In Japan, we have 120 military bases and about 60,000 people. We have in South Korea 73 bases. 26,000 people on the little tiny island of Guam. Tiny island, only has like 120,000 people on it. And there are 54 installations, military installations that are on that. I mean, you look at Hawaii, I mean, it's horrible. They didn't even put Hawaii on this one, but we've got tons of them. The level of military presence and equipment and pollution and damage to our climate is horrific. And one of the places that I wanted to emphasize right now is that in the summertime, in July and August, we'll be having the largest military naval exercises in the world, which are called Rim of the Pacific. And this year, after COVID is now kind of quieted down, there will be 27 countries that will be participating with their ships, the 225,000 personnel, 47 ships as a minimum, 250 aircraft, 5 submarines. And in 2018, the military said, oh, we used 18 million gallons of fuel. Well, I think they're going to be using a few million more. And that's one of the things that we want to keep track of, is how much fuel is being used. And when you look at aircraft carriers, this is the USS Abraham Lincoln, which has been off the coast of South Korea for the last month. It's the first time since 2017 that the US has sent aircraft carriers between Japan and South Korea. And of course, it's because of North Korea. And North Korea has been firing off some missiles. You have, here's a picture in Guam of the submarines. Now, some of the submarines don't use quite that kind of fuel. You know, they're nuclear powered submarines. And the nuclear catastrophe that could happen either by bombers dropping nuclear weapons, missiles firing them, and particularly missiles. There are more US nuclear tipped missiles that are on submarines than we have in that complex of land-based missiles up in the northern part of the United States. B-52 bombers. This is a lineup of B-52s that they put on Guam back in 2018, just to show the North Koreans that the Trump administration was watching them. And if you look right on the photograph on the left, here you have, well, they lined up every single thing that they had apparently on Guam, and they had some drones, some assassin drones that were there. And in fact, on Guam are going to be 6 assassin drones that are going to be permanently stationed there, and 6 in Hawaii. In Hawaii, you wonder, why in the world are they doing that? I mean, we're as far from a landmass that you could possibly be, except that the Marines are training to use them now. For the first time, the Marines are getting assassin drones, and they're going to use them in the little island chains, which are now part of their Marine mission statement, going to small islands and lay in wait for the enemy to come out. I put that picture up there because this great graphic that Jim showed earlier about how much fuel these big military jets use, this B-52, in 1 hour. And it would take from Missouri, where some of the B-52s are located, or up in North Dakota, North Dakota, where some of them are, it would be at least like 10 hours to get to Hawaii. And that would be, I mean, it's just incredible how much fuel these things use, and the pollution in the air. The other part of climate catastrophe is if anybody uses a nuclear weapon. And this is just to remind us how many nuclear weapons there are. And in fact, Russia and the United States have the most by far. Marcy mentioned the military catastrophe that we're dealing with on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, where in November, a sudden smell of fuel in the drinking water of 93,000 people, primarily military families that were living in these red areas over here. That's a little, you can't see most of it, but all of the affected areas were around the Pearl Harbor Naval Base. That's because the Naval Red Hill drinking water well was polluted from an incident that happened. If you go over to the left side, 20 massive storage tanks that were built in World War II, each one of them 100 or 250 feet high, 50 feet, 100 feet wide. They each will hold 12.5 million gallons of fuel for a total of 250 million gallons. Well, these things, they're 80 years old, 80 years old. I'm 75 and I can tell you, anything over 70 starts leaking. And these things have definitely started leaking. And I mean, massive leaks, massive leaks. And in fact, in November was another, what turned out to be about 19,000 gallons of jet fuel that went through a pipe that the Navy said they didn't even know about, and that went straight down into the Red Hill drinking water tank. Now, well, so we are now dealing with jet fuel that is in a plume that is in the aquifer of all of the drinking water of Honolulu. They have shut down some of the wells so that we won't draw the plume over to go into the drinking water for the rest of us that are using that well. It is a real mess. And at first the Navy said, oh, first, we don't know what's happening. Secondly, yeah, well, something happened. Thirdly, well, yeah, 19,000. And then now it turns out that probably the soil around all of that has been contaminated, and the vapors that are coming up from the pollution are such that families that have now finally that have gotten back into their homes after being 3 months in Waikiki hotels. Already the military has spent over $2 billion on just the military families and such. If this had happened, and if this had gone directly into the drinking water for the civilians that live on Oahu, of course, Department of Defense would not be paying for anything. We would have to suck it up, so to speak, with Hawaiian, with the tax base that we have in Hawaii, which means that it would not happen. We don't know what would happen if this is going to be contaminated. So that's one of the great problems that we're having. And of course, as we've been fighting in Hawaii, saying to the Navy the whole time, it wasn't like this wasn't known that was going to happen, that we weren't going to have a severe catastrophe with those Red Hill plants. I mean, we've been writing about it for decades, about these things have to be closed down. The steel lining of the tanks were only as thick as the side of a dime. And of course they were leaking. So national security, we've been saying, starts with clean water. And that's for all the bases that the United States has and any military has around the world. All of these bases are contaminated. They are contaminated, and people that have been living on them have been suffering. So what do? Well, we get out on the streets, and to the credit of the citizens of Oahu, we have had really great citizen support, people being out on the streets virtually every day, harassing, so to speak, the military. And it worked. I mean, finally, the Secretary of Defense has said, yes, they are going to close those tanks down, but we don't know when. And that's where the citizen activism comes in. The military says, well, we have another report we've got to do, then we've got to do this, we've got to do that. So we're keeping the pressure on from the citizen activist side, because the military, having been in that 29 years, we know how slippery that institution is. So we got to keep after them. Here's some of the tanks that were brought in to try to flush all of the drinking water that's now coming out of other wells, trying to flush everything out. So it's been a very expensive situation, and it's not over yet. Another bad situation is and I'll use the example over in Okinawa. We have a great activist in the United States named Pat Elder, who's worked with Vets for Peace all over the country, and he's been screaming about PFAS, the firefighting foam that's used in every military base. And be sure to check with your own firefighting people when they go out and they practice firefighting. And they fire up something and then they go put it out. Well, check with them to see what they're using, because the military for decades, since the 1970s when this stuff was invented, they've been using this PFAS, which is now called forever chemicals that will, it does not dissolve, and all this stuff goes into our rivers, our lakes, our oceans. So this is a place that the military is really taking heat on this, and they say by the year 2024 they will stop using all of this. Well, make sure that your own local fire departments are not using it either. And here's one of the tragic examples. This white stuff there is actually the PFAS, and it's in Okinawa, and it came from this building behind. It's an aircraft maintenance facility, and they were the whole PFAS system was there in case there was a fire on one of these aircraft as they were maintaining it. So they had the big system inside that building. Some of the fellows that worked in the building decided they'd have a barbecue just outside the front door of the building. They fired up the barbecue, and the system saw there was heat and started blowing out all of this stuff to put out the fire. Well, the guys didn't even know how to turn off the system. So all of this is now in the parking lot of this aircraft facility, and went into the rivers and the lakes of Okinawa. And the U.S. military was not honest with the people of Okinawa, and it was found out that PFAS was in the waters. And now the military, of course, is saying, oh, we didn't really mean to do that, which they didn't really mean to, but it's the fact that all of these things are dangerous, and they're so horrible for our environment and for people who are suffering from the ill effects, from cancer, from brain cancers, from all sorts of stuff. So these are the things that we have to hold our military accountable for, and we can do it in a lot of ways. I've got some resources that are up here, and I will put them in the chat, so anybody that wants a little more information about all of this can certainly have it. And I thank Vets for Peace for giving us the opportunity to talk about the climate and pollution and things. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. We are so grateful to you, Anne Wright of CODEPINK, retired Army colonel, military colonel. And we are so appreciative of the work that you're doing to shut down Red Hill, the fuel facility, and we wish you the best of luck and look forward to hearing more about those organizing tactics. Now on to our next speaker, and please do keep posting those questions that you have in the Q&A. Those of you who have mentioned you want to save these links, in the chat box at the bottom are 3 little dots. If you click on that, you should be able to save the chat. Okay, Erik Edstrom is next. He is a West Point graduate and infantry platoon leader in Afghanistan. He was a presidential escort platoon leader during the Obama administration. Erik studied climate change at Oxford University, earning a Master's of Science degree. He's also the author of Un-American, A Soldier's Reckoning of Our Longest War. Thank you, Erik, for joining us today.
Of course, thank you, Marcy, and thank you, Veterans for Peace, and thank you, David and Colonel and Wright, and for the wisdom, I think, of Veterans for Peace for having me last as the dud of the group behind David and Anne. It's hard to follow up their act, and when I Google Anne, I realize she is absolutely a badass. I didn't realize that she would receive a State Department award for heroism in 1997. So tough act to follow all around. I got a question earlier from the group, and I sort of just probed and I said, I can talk about a lot of different things. We can talk about, what I saw in the military, why I decided to study climate change. We can talk about climate science. We can talk about military budgets. We can talk about the military transitioning to decarbonize their force and their footprint. And what folks wanted to know about early on is, why did I make this transition? What happened? So I'm going to start quickly with a little bit of background about my own sort of personal journey, and then talk secondly about the military, and then thirdly about the money, and roughly in that order. So I grew up in Massachusetts, went to West Point, graduated in 2007, branched infantry. During the zeitgeist of the time, in sort of the mid-2000s, when you sort of think about what is public service as a young teenage boy, and what is a good way to serve society, the thing that flashed in my mind is serve in the military. And that was exactly what I figured I should go off and do. So went to West Point and was attracted to this notion of leadership and character development. And frankly, I didn't have the foggiest about the greater details about the invasion of Iraq, which happened when I was in high school, and Afghanistan. And of course, during the course of 4 years at West Point, you learn quite a lot about both those conflicts. And simultaneously, you're sort of groomed to want to go to those conflicts and participate in them, because otherwise, why else would you come to this, storied institution? And when I deployed to Afghanistan, I was in direct combat in Kandahar pre-surge in 2009 and 2010. It took about 1 week before I received my first casualties in my platoon, where an entire truck was blown up and I was evacuating 4 of my soldiers. And throughout the rest of the year, we took on about 25% casualties from my unit. I also saw that the war on terror was not providing any benefit to anyone. It was, some folks are like, well, was it worth, no value? And I was like, no, that's not correct. It was worth negative value. It was a negative sum conflict where no matter how well-intentioned an individual could be, they are in the downstream implications of really terrible decision-making upstream. So you can do your absolute darndest to be the most virtuous, most moral platoon leader, but you are still nonetheless trying to be as good as possible whilst occupying their land. And no amount of apologies for drone strikes hitting weddings or a scared PFC shooting a bus full of travelers, going down Highway 1 in Kandahar is ever going to make up for your nice intentions. And I saw this and I realized that this was not a good use of time. And I felt as though I was devoting my life to the wrong topic and going about it the completely wrong way. And I spent a lot of time reading, and I sort of thought about, like, what is it that I want to do? I knew I wanted to get out of the military, but I figured that there's other topics that are more deserving and more important than effectively playing Taliban whack-a-mole, where you are in a country and they have a clear and articulated desire to fight you for as long as you'll be there. So I decided to sort of shift my attention, and while attending graduate school, wanted to focus on climate science, and specifically stranded assets, which is basically in the intersection between the sort of private sector and climate science, which is like premature write-downs or devaluations of assets because of climate risk. So things are worth more or less, often less, because large parts of the world don't understand the climate science. And so there's a lot of additional inherent risk in supply chains. Land is worth obviously different amounts of money as well. If something that hasn't been able to grow anything for a long period of time now suddenly can, because of extreme warming in that area, and other parts being completely washed away. That's sort of that topic area. So that was sort of the origin of what attracted me to studying climate science. It seemed to me like, when we think of what are the largest threats to society and to the world, I mean, there's nuclear warfare and there's the existential threat of climate change. And the military is sort of at the nexus of both of these, and they are interrelated. So you realize that there's sort of this spinning mixture of different forces moving around, that fiscal policy and the amount that we spend on the military detracts as an opportunity cost from what we could be spending on climate change adaptation and mitigation. Also, the military, of course, as a contributor, is quite large. I, know that this group especially knows that quite well. I mean, the one factoid which I can throw out there, which we talked about, the largest individual consumer of petroleum, is that the U.S. military emits more emissions than 140 countries on Earth. 140 different countries. So as a contributor, the military itself, the US military specifically, is a very large lever. We've talked about already in this discussion, the 780 plus billion, which is going in the next couple of years to 800 plus billion. I think it was back in 2018 when President Trump raised the military budget. It was by 76 billion or something like that in 2018, which, by the way, was more than the entire Russian military budget as a whole. And that was just a one-year incremental increase on the defense budget. So it gives you a sense of scope and scale when we're talking about these sizes. When you talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and in 2018, we had a budget larger than their entire military. It's wild. So they are interconnected. And yes, it's worth talking about the military as a contributor to climate change. And it is absolutely, in my opinion, worth pressuring them. And I applaud Congresswoman Barbara Lee's resolution. I did a couple sort of news communication things around that time, because I think it's extremely important, not only just for accountability and transparency, but just to make objective, smart decisions. If you're the military trying to decarbonize, you should first baseline know where your emissions are coming from. So then you can start making trade-offs about which of these you want to remove the first. So if you don't know what is most important or what is most contributing most emissions, how do you even know where to begin? So let's get that information out there, and let's get a sense of, what is the return? There is some threshold. I think that most people will agree that the military has a job, but it has far exceeded the remit of that a long time ago in terms of where it's located with number of bases, as Professor Vine, I'm sure, could attest to in great detail. And by exceeding this threshold, we can start to sort of figure out where the emissions are and then apply political pressure to reduce in those areas. So I would love to see emissions figures published, but the problem is that that's going to be politically inconvenient for lots of folks. But the thing is, science and emissions and the atmosphere do not care. They do not care if it is politically inconvenient to count emissions. We should do what is objectively true and share that information widely. So there is that element as well. Furthermore, we can also talk about the military as a recipient of climate change's effects. I recently published an article, I co-authored a piece earlier this week, which was rather apropos on Yale climate connections with two other former military officers. One was Major General Dennis Leitch and former Colonel Larry Wilkerson, who is the chief of staff to the late Colin Powell. And we wrote this piece together, sort of talking about all these different dimensions that, yes, the military is a large contributor. Yes, they are also going to be impacted by climate change, therefore they should care about it. It's something like 50% of all of the bases have, this is from a 2018 study, have at least one or more critical effects or risks from climate change. So our bases as a platform or projection of power are also going to be at risk and potentially impaired, which the military does not want. And in my opinion, the next logical step, and I saw this in the Q&A, is switching to electric vehicles. Yes, it's absolutely important to decarbonize the military, but I think that in the same way as I, as a platoon leader in Afghanistan, was encouraged to not ask too many questions about why we're in Afghanistan or how this is actually making people in America safer, or do the Afghan people want us here, or what sort of long-term goals is this possibly supporting? We were not necessarily encouraged to do that. We were instead encouraged to focus specifically on the task at hand, patrolling, doing, what's in front of your field of vision, that sort of blocking and tackling 6 feet in front of you thinking. And if you get mired in the 6 feet in front of you thinking, you're missing the whole point. That you need to first answer the question of why are we doing this before you start asking, is this a good use of my time, or am I doing this activity well? I believe the same thing is true of the military when we're talking about their emissions. Yes, of course, we should think about how do we decarbonize B-52s or whatever, other large sinks of emissions. But the bigger point is, why are we funding it to this degree to create these emissions? So if we get stuck as a movement, as an organization around, we should be reducing this vehicle from X number of, usually it's the other way around, gallons per mile, not miles per gallon. If we get focused on how do we improve efficiency of, our MRAPs, we're missing the point, which is, why are we spending so much money on this when there is always financially and economically a opportunity cost associated with every dollar you spend? And so I tried to make clear in my book, which was called Un-American: A Soldier's Reckoning of Our Longest War. It looks a bit like this. One of the things I talked about in there was that every dollar that we are spending on military conflict today, especially in the war on terror conflict, is not only negative sum, but it is actually, you're spending money twice. You're spending money and throwing it in a hole and wasting money, and you're also simultaneously, because you are ignoring climate change, reinvesting in future wars caused by climate change because you didn't address it at that particular point in time. And so it is actually a double waste. You're spending it on poor return on investment political violence today, and you are investing in far larger and worse wars of resource scarcity, food insecurity, displaced persons and refugees. And those wars are going to make the war on terror look like child's play, because they are going to be so much broader in scale, so much harder to control, and they're going to affect so many more people. So yes, there are 38 odd million plus refugees across the greater Middle East from the war on terror. This is horrendous. Climate change is not going to stop. It will be relentless. And so you'll have refugees in those numbers or far more, but just ongoing towards perpetuity. So you're going to continue to play, moving people around as, food stuffs grow in a very narrow band of precipitation and humidity and temperatures, and growing conditions need to be right. Diurnal temperature changes, such as how hot is it during the hottest part of the day versus the coldest part of the night. Those things all matter to growing crops, and any sort of volatility to that, could displace, I think it's wheat, rice, soybeans, and maize, corn, responsible for something like 75% of the world's caloric footprint. So any changes to temperatures, you displace the sort of amount that's being produced, and you have widespread potential famines. So again, it's like, why are we focusing on this when this is the much larger issue? And my encouragement is, don't get focused on the miles per gallon. Get focused on how we can allocate money to the biggest problem today, because otherwise it's a double reinvestment in failure. You're investing in new technology for the military, which is maybe an incremental, it's window dressing, and you're simultaneously allowing the climate crisis to get worse. So both are happening at the same time. The other thing that I really wanted to talk about is how do you speak to these people? There's many different ways. Lots of well-intentioned people in the military, lots of well-intentioned people in Congress voting for terrible things. I think that this movement needs a slightly different, and forgive me, slightly different argument, which is maybe more susceptible to the establishment congressmen and establishment military folks. And that I tried to lay out in this most recent article, which I referred to it as Climate Action as Patriotism. And there's a lot of people that, especially on this call, I imagine, given that we're of the topic we're discussing, do not need further encouragement that climate change is real, that it is serious, and we need to do something about it now. But there is still a significant portion of American population that either don't care what scientists say, they question facts, they don't know what the IPCC is. And so for this group, speak to them on the wavelength that touches what they care about. And I tried to position this article such that you would basically be saying, something to the effect of, if you are not addressing climate change, you are setting up your troops, American soldiers, for failure. That the US military and soldiers do not have the capacity, the US military does not have the capacity to provide national security in the way that we do today, well, spread across all these bases all over the world. They do not want to do that in a 1.5, 2.5, 3 degree, 4 degree world, because then you hit them where it matters, which is at the kitchen table, saying that those are going to be their children, their grandchildren, deployed more often to worse conflicts, and that will continue in perpetuity. More dangerous tours of duty. And so if you're not doing anything about climate action today, you're hosing your own US military. And that, hopefully, I'm hoping, is my best shot at trying to create an argument that maybe someone will care about, because what we have done in the past has not gotten us to where we need to be. And I'm very thankful to groups like this that continue pushing, rain or shine, for what matters. So thank you very much. And I look forward to Q&A.
Thank you, Erik Edstrom, West Point graduate, platoon leader in Afghanistan, author. A lot of what you said resonated. Militarism being a climate crisis multiplier, a threat multiplier. The World Bank is estimating minimally we'll have 150 million climate refugees in the coming years. So this, absolutely is urgent. We're going to open it up now for Q&A, and I'm so pleased to share this with Vince Dejanich, who is also a member of the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project. And Vince is going to lead off with the first question for our 3 panelists: David Vine, author David Vine, retired Colonel and Wright, and Erik Edstrom, who we just heard from. Vince, you're on.
I'm going to just start at the top of the chat, the Q&A. And this first one is, even if we fail to stop climate change before the deadline, that doesn't mean we shouldn't give up hope and stop the fight against climate change. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, that wasn't easy.
Yes, and keep going.
Yeah, it's degrees of bad, and each one, like a Richter scale, is a multiple, logarithmically worse than the one before it. So even and as the latest IPCC AR6 was saying, we're not on track for 1.5 degrees. We're probably not going to hit that globally. And that, even if you stopped at 2, that's still much better than getting to 2.5. If it's 2.5, that's still much better than 3. So no matter what, it's always good to continue applying pressure to stop as soon as possible.
Thank you. I'm going to go to another question that was posted in the Q&A, and this has to do with Ukraine. Here we are looking at a protracted war. We're calling CODEPINK, Veterans for Peace is calling for ceasefire and negotiations. But all around us, we hear the voices amplified on TV and the media for more weapons for Ukraine, a protracted war or worse. You know, we're really flirting with something so very dangerous, as we all know on this Zoom. So the question that was posted is something along the lines of, what compromises could we be advocating or supporting? Should the US be pushing to ensure that this is not another protracted war or a nuclear exchange? What's realistic? How do we end this crisis in Ukraine? Who wants to take it?
Of course, can I jump in on that?
Yeah.
So, you know, of course, that's the, I don't know, $1 trillion question, but I think the Biden administration, as far as I can tell, of course, you don't know what is going on behind the scenes, but as far as I can tell, is not committed enough to negotiations and any attempt at compromise, and the same goes for NATO. I think several things could be put on the table by the United States and NATO, either, and I think when we think about diplomatic negotiations, we have to think both about things that could be offered publicly, and as in the Cuban Missile Crisis, things that could be offered behind the scenes. The withdrawal of U.S. Missiles from Turkey was not publicly announced, but it was part of what brought the Cuban Missile Crisis to an end, de-escalated that crisis. And similarly, the Biden administration could make promises out of public view. But I think ensuring that there is no expansion of NATO to any other countries, unless Russia becomes a member of NATO, would be one promise that could be made, I think, quite publicly. Basically a freezing on NATO membership. Promises about not building new US military bases in Europe. The United States already has far too many military bases in Europe. And promises about other forms of military engagement and the emplacement of particular weapon systems in existing US bases in Europe could be another thing that the United States could offer, as well as the withdrawal of sanctions. I think that has to probably be first and certainly has to be central.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of other things. Part of it is this part of an American strategy to bleed the Russians, as was done during the Cold War, at the expense of the Ukrainians. I mean, for 8 years, there certainly was plenty of information out there for everyone that Russia was saying, come on, Ukraine is kind of the red line that we've got, and you guys in NATO and U.S. keep having all of these military exercises, war games right next to us. They were letting us know they were very concerned about their national security, and it never should have gotten to this point. It should have, there should have been huge negotiations beforehand. The Minsk agreement should have been worked on harder. The U.S. should have not become such uppity and arrogant, like it's our way or no way, which seems to be the way of American diplomacy, if you want to call it that. That's just the way we seem to be doing things, which is just tragic for us as Americans, and tragic for the world, because a lot of people have been killed for that over the decades, and we're seeing it play out again in Ukraine and Yemen and every place else. That's my speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
I have a question for Erik. How can we get your and other people's other younger veterans' voices into mainstream media about the climate crisis? How can we boost a signal about military as being a driver of the climate crisis?
Man, it's so hard. I appreciate that question. I pitched that article. I'll drop it in the chat right now. This is the one I published earlier this week with Yale Climate Connections, which is an extension of, I think, their geography department at Yale University. I pitched this thing with the help of a publicist to all the mainstream media. No one took it. This is sort of how it goes. It's interesting. I mean, there's times when I can get something posted in USA Today, which has wide circulation. Sometimes I might get something posted in a smaller but sort of literary place, whether this is like the New Republic or I don't know, any number of other sort of magazines, but not a huge readership. It's challenging though, and I mean, I've pitched this to many different places. I belong to a group called Eisenhower Media Network, which, given all the Eisenhower quotes, I think most people sort of align with this sort of anti-military industrial complex angle. And there's sort of basically a stable or group of former veterans and intelligence officials who are willing to speak on the record about any number of other topics. And we have a fully staffed publicist that basically will try to take our work and get it placed. And I do not have the answer. I wish I did. I've tried. Sometimes I get something, sometimes I don't. But when it comes to climate change, I have found it quite difficult to get traction.
David, we want to thank you for your work on closing bases and for your work on trying to shut down that fuel facility, and Erik, for your being published in USA Today. That's no small feat. I'm just looking at this on the internet that the USA Today has a print circulation of 726,000, a digital only subscriber base of 504,000, a daily readership of 2.6 million, and is ranked first in circulation on the list of newspapers in the United States. So kudos to you. All right, we're going to ask a couple more questions, then wrap it up as we're running a little bit over. My question is to David. You've been working to close some of the United States' 750 military bases. Which bases do you think could be closed realistically? The military would accept the closure of these bases?
I think we should always be careful about what we consider realistic and unrealistic, and not accept predetermined notions of what is realistic. The George W. Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the George H.W. Bush administration all closed hundreds of bases in Europe and Asia. There is precedent. Unlike domestic bases, it is far easier to close bases abroad because the president can do it. And last I checked, the president is the commander in chief. For that matter, unfortunately, the Biden administration has shown, even prior to the start of Putin's war in Ukraine, has shown no signs of moving in that direction, and indeed only some signs of expanding the U.S. military base presence in Asia in particular. And there have already been and will continue to be calls to build new U.S. bases in Europe. Again, I would just emphasize there were far too many U.S. bases in Europe already, and we could afford to close many, many more. Again, the military capacity of the NATO members in Europe far exceeds that of Russia alone. And you can also create other forms of military-to-military agreements that in some case of emergency, U.S. troops could be deployed to host nation bases. There are many alternatives, and people across the political spectrum are coming to the conclusion that the United States needs to close many, many of its bases abroad, which are in many ways undermining U.S. national security.
Thank you. Vince, perhaps one last question?
Okay. This is to all of you. Why is the general public not more scared of the war in Ukraine going nuclear? Why aren't we seeing the protests? Anybody can take a stab at that one.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. Well, I tell you, it's a mystery to me, and the Earth Day events that are going on today and tomorrow, really aren't focusing on nuclear issues at all, which is a tragedy because that may be our ultimate tragedy. And, so it's a mystery why there's not that much focus on it, particularly after 3 or 4 years ago, we finally had the treaty on the abolition of nuclear weapons and all that. It's been in the news, but I think it's probably so distant in people's minds, except in Hawaii, where we did have a incoming nuclear missile scare 5 years ago. And let me tell you what, that did it. Then in Hawaii, people do listen because that scared the bejesus out of people when they thought on their cell phone, here was an incoming missile, take cover. So that's it. That's all I know.
Thank you. Any final words from David or Erik?
Okay, I'll just jump in. I think there is greater awareness and fear of nuclear war now than there was prior to the start of Putin's war in Ukraine, and we have to take advantage of that. I think this is a moment of potentially world historic change, and others are seeking to take advantage of it. The military-industrial complex is seeking to take advantage of this moment to reap billions more in profits, among others who are seeking to take advantage of it for ill. We need to take advantage of this moment to change consciousness around the existential threat of nuclear weapons, around the money that's being diverted from saving the planet from climate change, global warming, and the broader diversion of funds from truly protecting our needs. But I think this is a moment when we can, and people are calling for a reinvigorated anti-nuclear movement, given the real threat of nuclear war that now is greater than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Thank you. And Erik?
I don't want to overstay my welcome, so I will just certainly say thank you for hosting me. It's a real pleasure that I get the opportunity to share some time with you, and thank you so much for being engaged on these important topics.
Wonderful. I want to thank all of you, our panelists, David Vine, Ann Wright, Erik Edstrom, for joining us today. And I also want to express my appreciation to all of you who attended this for your participation, your questions, and your relentless organizing and activism. Please do amplify our message that militarism worsens the climate crisis. Take this message back to your community. Think of which groups would benefit from seeing the slideshow that Jim Ryan presented earlier. If you want to invite Veterans for Peace to show this slideshow, you can sign up at the Veterans for Peace Climate Militarism webpage. You can Google it, it comes right up. And we can share the slideshow with a group in your community or beyond. Please also consider signing up to join the Veterans for Peace Climate Militarism project. Another reminder, ask your House rep to co-sponsor HRES 767. That's Congresswoman Barbara Lee's resolution calling on the Pentagon to track, reduce, and report greenhouse gas emissions. And while you're at it, ask your reps, members of the House and the Senate, to co-sponsor bills introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders and Congresswoman Cori Bush to invoke the Defense Production Act, the DPA, to transition to 100% renewable energy. Those bills are H.R. 7439, and S.4013. I put those in the chat as well. Again, I'm Marcy Winograd. I'm a proud member of the Climate Crisis Militarism Project for Veterans for Peace. I'm also the coordinator of CODEPINK Congress. And I ask that you please join me and CODEPINK co-founder Medea Benjamin, Ann Wright, Alice Slater, others who've been on this call with us, this webinar, the first and third Tuesday of the month, when we focus on a specific foreign policy issue and we take action. CODEPINK Congress, we're on the web, along with Veterans for Peace, the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project. Again, thank you all and keep at it. Peace.